Now that we have our bundles written that import both jQuery and Bootstrap, I'm going to go ahead and put together a really basic admin layout. Because the next section is all going to be about the database and backend code and stuff like that, we want to have something nice to look at in the admin area. We're not going to focus too much on the front end until the section after the next one, so let's go ahead and get started with that. First of all, I'm going to open up the site here and I'm going to log in with Nelson and anything just so I can get the admin role. And then I'm going to click on View Posts and Admin. And we see that we have this admin posts content being written back. What I want to do is I want to go into Areas Admin Controllers and I want posts and users to both return a actual view that takes advantage of a layout, and then the layout will import the bundles and it'll throw some Bootstrap awesomeness in, and life will be grand.
Sweet. That
Okay,
sounds sexy.
it does. It is. You'll see. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a view for both my users index and my posts index. So now both the users controller and the post controllers return a view. Now that I've done that, I can open up the views here and I can start working on, well, the views. I know that's a little bit redundant, but they really named these folders pretty well.
We can live with that.
Yeah. Okay, so what do I need to do? Well, I need to create a new folder, one for posts and one for users. Remember, that's how ASP.NET MVC is going to locate our views based off the controller and the action. So once we have that, all we need to do is create a simple CSHTML file in both posts and users. So I'm going to do that by right-clicking posts, going to add view, and I'm going to call it index. Now, I don't really care about all these options because I'm pretty much going to nuke all the code out of this template after I hit add, which there isn't a whole lot of code to nuke. Inside of this, I'm just going to write an h1 tag, and I'm going to call it posts, so we know which page we're on. Next up, I'm going to do the same thing for users. Right-click, add view, call it index, hit add, and now we have an h1 with users.
Sounds good so far.
Alright, so that's pretty good, but we're missing something. If I were to now compile this application by hitting F6, coming back to my browser and hitting F5, we'll just see posts, and if we view source, we'll see all we see is that h1. That's because we're missing a layout. We don't have any layout for our admin. This might be a little bit confusing for people who recall our view start down here in our front end, but this view start only applies to everything underneath this views folder. It does not apply to the views inside of the admin, which is nice because in the admin I can use the same technique, create a layout in my shared folder, and then create a viewstart.cshtml to, by default, set the layout to that layout. You know what I mean.
Sure.
Another aptly named thing. Okay, so under shared, I'm going to go to add view, and I'm going to call it underscore layout. Now, for my layout, I'm going to blank it out. I'm just going to grab my layout CSHTML from my front end. I know we're not really playing around too much with the front end, but I just want to grab the doc type and other things I'm too lazy to remember. Same with the using system web optimization, which it looks like we already have imported, so that's all good. We want the layout equals null. We want our doc type. We want our head. We want our... I'm not going to care too much about the title. I'm just going to call it simple blog admin. Next up, we want to do our styles, which will be under admin/styles. Remember, that comes from underneath our view start or app start. We have a bundle config.cs file. And you see that we have registered an admin styles bundle. So that's what I want to render out right here. So once we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and pretty much remove all of this code except for the render body, and remove the header, remove the footer, and then update my scripts to go to admin/scripts. And that's really it. Just to prove that I have the layout working, for now I'm just going to say this is the admin and an h1 tag. So once I see this is the admin, I know everything is working.
Alrighty.
Next up, I want to add in a view start so that all the views by default use this view as a layout. So to do that, I'm going to go under Areas, Admin, Views, right-click, hit Add View, and I'm going to call it underscore View Start. And remember, the name is important in this case. It's not going to be picked up unless it is indeed View Start. All I'm going to do in View Start is I'm going to remove all the markup out of it. Then I'm going to add a single line of C# called layout equals, and I'm going to pass in the path, the virtual path, to my layout file in the admin, which is under areas, admin, views, shared, underscore, layout.cshtml.
Alrighty then.
Okay, so if I come back here and open up our posts, we now have a layout. Not only do we have a layout, we also have the purple background that we set up in the last video. Okay, so that's pretty awesome. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to close all my documents. I'm going to find my admin.css, which is down here under Content Styles Admin. And I'm simply going to remove this body because that purple is really gross.
There we go. We don't like gross, so that's cool. I'm glad you did that.
Well, again, the purple is just there to make sure that everything is wired up, which it is, so now we can remove it. Okay, so the rest of this video, we're just going to be spending inside the layout.cs, or mostly spending inside the layout.cs.html, and I'll get to that mostly here in a moment. So let's go ahead and write out a really basic Bootstrap-enabled admin style. It's a lot less scary than it sounds. I'm going to remove all the code except for the render body, the scripts render, and the render section. I'm going to open up a div class with a class of container that pulls from Bootstrap. That's a Bootstrap class. Then I'm going to use Bootstrap to create a navigation item. So that's going to be under a UL with the class of nav and nav pills. That's the layout or the menu style that we want. Again, this comes from Bootstrap. Next up, I'm going to create 3 LIs inside of my UL. The reason I'm creating 3 is because I want 3 links. The first link is going to be I'm just going to use an HTML action link to my posts controller. So the title of the link is posts, the action is index, the controller is posts, and the area is admin. Now, if you have any experience with ASP.NET MVC, you'll notice a problem with this action link. Hint, index is red, and we'll talk about why that happens here in a moment. But first, I'll finish the rest of the links. Next, I'm going to do an action link to users, going to the index action on the user's controller with an area of admin. Finally, I'm going to add an action link to, a route link to the home route, which is the, so I'm going to call it back to website, and I'm going to pass in the home route. And that way this link will route back to the home page on the front end. So if I save all that out, come back to Simple Blog and hit refresh, we'll notice we have this little navigation menu up here. But if we look at the URLs that were generated, look at that. The back to website works, but look what happens when I click on posts and users.
That's because of the scary red letters that say index.
Yep, exactly. What's happening here is this is where all these overloads start to get really, really annoying. We are not using the correct overload. The overload I want to use is one that will let me specify the action, the controller, and the area. However, what I'm actually setting right now is the action, the route values, and the HTML attributes. As you can see by this overload that's highlighted. In fact, if I were to actually look at posts, we should see that it has an HTML attribute of area equals admin. Obviously, that's not what I want. I want the admin to be the route values that is sent into the URL generator. So that's one of the reasons why I don't use ActionLink very much, and it's another reason why I wanted to show you guys using ActionLink, to show you guys why, sometimes your routes don't quite work when you don't use the correct overload. The only way that I'm aware of to use the correct overload is to use this overload. This overload allows you to specify the link text, the action name, the controller name, the route values, and the HTML attributes. To have this overload be resolved to, we need to provide one more parameter of type object. So all I'm going to do is simply do comma new object, and that's it. By doing that, we are now telling the C# compiler to use the overload that has this be the action and this be the controller, as opposed to this overload where it has this as the action and this as the route values, and this as the HTML attributes. So I'm going to finish that up, unfix that, come back here, hit refresh. We should now be able to navigate between posts and users.
Very nice.
Okay, a couple other things. I want the back to website link to appear to the right, so I'm going to give it the class of pull right. Again, this is provided to us by Bootstrap. Then I'm going to place the render body inside of my div container so that it's properly centered. So this is pretty much most of the markup that I wanted to put together, and see how it's a little bit different now that back to website's all the way at the right and the content is indeed centered. There's a couple more things that I want to do. I want the current tab to be highlighted. One of the reasons I want to do it is because it's going to look cool. Another reason is it gives us an excuse to play around with a couple new techniques in ASP.NET MVC. One of them is going to be creating a custom filter. Now, we've seen examples of filters before inside of our users and posts controller. We've seen the authorize filter, which simply makes it so that any action executed on this controller requires the user is both authenticated and authorized under the admin role. But it shouldn't come as a surprise that we can write our own filters to effectively do anything we want. The filter that I want to write is going to specify which one of these tabs should be highlighted on our admin when we're at a particular action. So what the filter is effectively going to do is it's going to be attached to a controller or a method, or an action, sorry, and it's going to accept a string, and that string is going to tell it what tab is selected. Then the filter is going to have to tell the view what tab is selected. And so this is where things get a little fun. To create this filter, all you need to do is create a class, just like any other attribute. So I'm going to, under my infrastructure folder, I'm going to create a new class called selected tab, or I'm just going to say selected tab attribute. As you know, when creating custom attributes, you should always have the name of the attribute end with the word attribute. Okay, so I said this is an attribute, so let's go ahead and make it an attribute. To do that, I'm going to inherit from the action filter attribute. Now, I need to import a namespace, so I'll have ReSharper do that for me. And now we'll get something a little fun. ReSharper is asking me which action filter attribute do I want to import. You'll notice we have System Web HTTP filters and System Web MVC. Which one do you think we should use?
I think the MVC one.
Correct. What this is the Web API has a lot of similar functionality to ASP.NET MVC, but it hasn't yet been coalesced into the same library. So there are two action filter attributes, one for Web API and one for MVC. We want to use the MVC one because, well, we're doing ASP.NET MVC. If we tried to hook up a action filter attribute that was written for Web API, it wouldn't quite work because we're not using Web API. So I'm going to click on this one, and we'll get a using System Web MVC at the top.
Very nice.
Okay, so this is an action filter attribute. So this class inherits from attribute, which allows us to attach our class to different attributes. However, I also want to add an attribute usage, which comes from system. So you have to do a using system to get attribute usage, because I only want this attribute to be valid on classes and methods. So by doing that, I now make it a compiler error to attach this attribute to anywhere else an attribute is allowed to be attached to, such as fields, properties, parameters, and so on. Okay, so that's all interesting, but earlier I said that I wanted this selected tab attribute to require a string that identifies which one of the tabs should be considered to be selected. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a constructor with a string parameter of selected tab, and I'm going to have the selected tab be aliased out into a private read-only string field. Okay, so we have a constructor, it takes in selected tab, and all it does is it assigns that to a private read-only string selected tab field. But we still have a problem. We've collected the data, but we haven't in any way made it available to our views. How do we do that? Well, remember, action filters get invoked when an action on a controller gets invoked. That's not entirely true. There's actually quite a few more times or places that an attribute will, or action filter, I'm going to get those two terms confused, so bear with me. An action filter gets invoked, and we can see that list by looking at the override members. The override members that we can, or the methods that we can override to basically plug into the ASP.NET MVC request cycle are action executing, action executed, result executing, and result executed. So this is before the action is executed, this is after it is, this is before the result is executed, and this is after it is.
Gotcha.
The one that we want is on result executing. Now, if you don't have ReSharper installed, don't worry. You can literally just type in this code right here, public override void on result executing. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the default implementation there because I'm not wanting to invoke the base behavior. Instead, I need to set something on the view bag to tell the layout which tab is selected. So how do I get to the view bag? Well, we have this result executing context called filter context. And if I open it up, we have a lot of really fun things that we can do with it. One of them is accessing the controller. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to access the controller. Then, once I have access to the controller, I have access to the view bag. So by getting access to the view bag, I can now communicate between my filter and my layout. All I'm going to do is set selected tab to underscore selected tab. If you recall, that's what was passed into the constructor of this attribute.
That's wonderful.
Yep. So now the data is available in our view. So how do we, well, use it? If we go back to users controller, I want any action executed in users controller to select the users tab. So I'm going to add my new attribute to this class. I'm simply going to say selected tab attribute users. Now, of course, because this is a different namespace, we have to import simpleblog.infrastructure. Now this selected tab filter is attached to all of the actions within the users controller, which means that now the layout will know that the users tab should be selected. Let's do the same thing to our posts controller. I'm going to jump back to post controller, and I'm going to add a selected tab, and I'm going to say posts, and then I'm going to import the simpleblog infrastructure namespace. Okay, so now we have a selected tab attribute on both our posts and our users, but we're not using that information yet. We've made it so the layout is aware that our selected tab is selected tab, but this is just a bucket of data. The layout isn't actually doing anything with it yet. So jumping back into the layout, what I want to have happen is if the posts tab is selected, I want this li to have the class of active. The active class is used in Bootstrap to determine if a particular navigation item is selected. And then I want to do the same thing with this li for users. So I can accomplish this with a simple attribute and ternary inside of Razor. So what I'm going to do is I want to write a Razor expression that will return the text active if the currently selected tab is set to posts. So I'm going to open up a Razor expression, but I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to wrap it inside of parentheses. That's because the ternary expression, which we'll see in a moment, isn't able to be inferred by Razor as being C# code without you giving it a little bit more of a hint. The hint in this case is wrapping it inside of parentheses. Now the ternary is going to look like this. It's simply going to be viewbag.selectedTab equals posts, then active, otherwise empty. So, if the selected tab is posts, we print out this text active into the class attribute. If it's not posts, we print out the text empty string into the class attribute. So let's do that again for our users. I'm going to say class viewBag.selectedTab equals users, question mark, active, colon, blank, empty string. Now, if the viewBag.selectedTab was not set by anyone, it's not going to cause an error to do this. Instead, selectedTab is simply going to be null, and null will never equal posts, and neither of these tabs will be considered active. Now, of course, I'm going to have to recompile because I added an attribute and modified my controllers. So let's do that, and then jump back into the browser and see what happens. We now have the posts selected, and if we go over to users, we now have users selected.
That is sweet.
Yep. There's one more thing I want to do in this video, and that is to show a very useful Razor technique that I couldn't seem to fit in anywhere else because it wasn't very appropriate anywhere else, but it is fairly appropriate for this case. And that is, we have a bit of code duplication here on line 17 and line 20. What I want to do is I want to write a function that gets something like posts or users, and I want that function to return either active if the selected tab equals that, or empty string if it does not. So I could certainly add an extension method to the HTML helper class, or I could do something way more awesome and create what's called a helper inside of the CSHTML file. So to do that, I'm going to say @helper. Then I'm going to call selected tab class, and it's going to take in a string tab name. Then, if tab name equals viewBag.selected tag, I want to print out the text active.
Okie dokie.
So, this is now effectively a function that I just declared inside of Razor. Remember how I said these CSHTML files turn into classes and then are compiled? Well, this is essentially a method on that class, and I can now reuse it all over the CSHTML file, which means I can effectively replace this ternary code with @selected tab class posts. So see the difference between this code and this code?
Yeah, now you can get them to refer back to the one chunk of code that you made instead of rewriting it a gazillion times.
Exactly. And if I were to add more maybe submenus and drop downs and different controllers, I would have to repeat a lot less code.
That's awesome.
So
We like less.
You what?
We like less.
Yes, less is good. Less is actually good. Less is a CSS preprocessor, which unfortunately didn't have enough time to squeeze into the series. But anyway, next up I'm going to do the users, which is going to be selected tab class users. Okay, so if I come back to this, hit refresh, we now break. And the reason we break is if we look inside here, we're not actually echoing out the right thing. We're emptying out or echoing out empty on both cases. And that's because I misspelled selected tab. I said selected tag.
Ah, yep, there you go.
It's actually part of a confusion I have between those two words because in Washington we call them car tabs, but in Tennessee they're called car tags, and I have had arguments about it, so now I basically get those two words mixed up.
Now we know why.
Okay, if I come back here and refresh, it works again. Okay, so that just about wraps everything up in this video. Just to recap, we created our basic index action views for posts and users. We created our admin layout, our admin view start, and we took a look at a custom action filter that allows us to declaratively pass data into my layout so that my layout can use this awesome helper method to determine if a class or if a tab is currently selected. So, as always, the last thing we're going to have to do is jump into source tree, wait for it to update, stage all of my changes, commit, and say put together basic admin layout.
Very nice.
Commit that, check my history, and I think we're good.
Alrighty, well, let's rock on to the next section.
Awesome.